do with I'm spending this year in the Department of Ecology at Stanford, and that's that notion that we live in a sort of an ecosystem, a food chain, if you will, but that if you damage a single link on the chain, a weak link, the whole system could go down. It's one of the great privileges this year. My office is next door to that of Paul Ehrlich, who was like icon to me growing up. And he developed a theory called the rivet theory. He and his wife developed this about 25 years ago. Many of you may be familiar with it, that if you're on an airplane and you pull off a rivet out of the airplane, it'll probably continue to fly. Take another one off, it might continue flying. But eventually, if you keep taking rivets out of the airplane, eventually it's going to fall apart and crash. And that is exactly the sort of ecological truth that we all are quite aware of. The same is true, I think, socially, this notion of we have to worry about the weakest elements in our society. And it's unimaginable to me that 500,000 children go to bed hungry in a state with this kind of prosperity. And this causes a real question for me about how do we rethink our tax structure so that we can ensure that we also have our 1%ers there are paying more, and that we find serious programs to offer opportunities to the poorest children, because many of the children find themselves in a trap where if they belong to a certain community, say an ultra-Orthodox community, they will not get the education they need to be a productive member of society and to be able to attend university and to be part of this growing economy. So that issue of helping the weakest link is something which is very important. I guess it's something which you could find also in the Israeli left. A third issue, which I think makes us unique in terms of our own perspective on these issues, is the notion of carrying capacity. And this is a complicated issue, but I'll just put it to you this way. Israel is a small country. It's about the size of New Jersey. In 1950, there were 1 million people living in Israel. In 1960, there were 2 million people living in Israel. 1970, there were 3 million, and you can do the math up to 7.8 million people today. And I think anybody who thinks seriously about living on a planet with limited biological infrastructure realizes that the term sustainable growth is an oxymoron. You cannot grow forever. And whenever I had an interesting argument about this with a woman she's the wife of the chairman of the Jewish National Fund, and she was I was talking to her, we have to start talking about population and carrying capacity. And she found this to be somewhat sacrilegious, and how can you, as somebody who calls yourself a Zionist, this is sort of the raison d'etre of the country. So I told her the famous story about Winston Churchill. This is, everybody knows Winston Churchill had a political rival named Lady Astor. And they would be always arguing with each other. There's the famous story where he was drunk, and she says, "Sir Winston, you're drunk." And he said, "Lady Astor, you're ugly. Only tomorrow I'll be sober." So they're always having these kind of clever exchanges. And Churchill, so one night, Winston Churchill was at a dinner party and drinking, whatever, and he turned to Lady Astor. And he said, "Lady Astor, would you sleep with me for £1 million?" And she said, "Well, Winston, that is the most insulting, revolting offer, but for that much money I might suffer just such an ultimate indignity." But he said, "Well, how about £5?" And she said, "Sir Winston, I'm insulted." And he said, "Madam, we've already established the principle, now we're just negotiating." So anyway, the point is that, and I immediately said to her, "Listen, would you imagine, now there's less 7 million people, there's say, maybe 3 million people in the Palestinian Authority. Can you imagine a situation where there's 100 million people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean?" And she said, "That'd be unbearable." I said, "How about 20? I mean, now we're just negotiating. Now once we've established the principle that there is a physical limitation, let's do this dispassionately in such a way before it's too late." I always use the metaphor of the corals in a lot. Israel is really blessed by its access to the Red Sea. The cities of Aqaba and Jordan and Eilat are contiguous. I don't know how many of you have been to Israel, but there's a wonderful, one of the world's most northern coral reefs. If you've been to Hawaii, it's something comparable to the kind of fish you can see there. Only what we're seeing is a collapse of that particular ecosystem. About 10 years ago, they did a study and discovered that 30% of the fish in the corals were dead or dying, losing their turning bleaching or whatever. And then they did the same study 3 years ago and found that the numbers had switched, that 70% now were more abundant, and 30% were surviving. And really we have a problem, and there's lots of reasons why. It's the there's a port there where there's potash, and that leads to discharge of phosphorus into the bay, and there's lots of tourist boats that dump all kinds of oil off the ship. But the real problem is people. It's the most dived and snorkeled piece of beach in the world. And with all people's love and attention, they are literally loving these corals to death. And so we're going to have to limit the number of people on our corals if we want to preserve anything. And I think that's a metaphor for our entire country. And that's just the environmental side of it. But when I talk about these social issues, oftentimes I feel like the problem of population is like that famous metaphor of the 12 blind Indian men who saw the elephant together, and each one of them took a look at the elephant and saw something different. So the one said, "Oh, I see, it's a pillar here." And the other one said, "Oh, and he looked at the leg." And another one said, "Oh, I'm looking at a vine." It was, something, the tail, whatever. Anyway, each 12 of them saw something completely different, and of course it was the same elephant. So when I look at the pathology of so many of Israel's social woes, if it's the problem of education and the fact that so many children go to classes with 40 and 45 kids in that class, or the number of beds, hospital beds, in the hallway because they don't have capacity anymore, or the years you have to wait before you can get a court date, and you just go down the line one after the other, I see it's because we have this incredible geometric growth, and we have to start thinking about this. Surely the problem of poverty in Israel cannot be solved if we don't deal with the issue of large families, because just about 80% of the poor people that we're talking about are in families with 10 or more children in it. And that's a real challenge to us in a country that has so much religious, how should I put it, charged dynamics, that this immediately becomes an emotional issue, it becomes a political issue. But I believe that as a responsible party, we have to talk about the cause of problems, just not only the symptoms of it. And we had a very, very heated debate in our convention, because when I was elected chairman, I said, this is an issue which I've been writing about for 15 years, and we had to start talking about it. It's uncomfortable, but if we're honest, we have to look ourselves in the eye and be straight. And so we decided that, in fact, we would adopt a position, recognize this as an issue. Maybe we won't make this our lead issue in the campaign, although that remains to be seen. I think it's something that Israelis are starting to recognize. And we have to start thinking about this from a public policy perspective. And I can talk about this in greater detail if you want. But that goes back to that issue of carrying capacity. The other issue which I wanted to talk about, and this will be sort of my last one, is the issue of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is sort of the fundamental paradigm that has driven environmental regulation around the world. This notion is that somehow or other, these places which belong to everybody but nobody in particular are being lost. Certainly environmentally, we see the loss of commons, of its air quality, and the fact that maybe 1,000 Israelis die prematurely every year because of the high concentrations of fine particles in the air in our cities. It could be beaches that for a long time are being sold off, a little less so now, but still developers find loopholes and manage to take these properties away from the public. But it's not only that, it's a range of assets which the public used to enjoy. When I first moved to Israel, every city in the country had a public swimming pool. And you went and you paid a nominal fee when swimming, or almost often it was for free. Today, you can still go swimming, and there are pools which are much, much nicer. The problem is that almost all of them are now in sort of country clubs or small swim clubs. So if you have the $2,000 to $3,000 a year, you can go swimming. If not, well, you can go to the beach. Only when you go to the beach, you have to pay for parking and the lot and the way in there. And I think that's symbolic of a lot of things that used to be for free. I think it is outrageous. There are communities in Israel which are becoming gated, so they have security, which should be a public good. Part of that commons that we all should be share, they have it better off. I talked already about education and the gap between some of the different neighborhoods. And I think in a range of areas we have to reclaim the commons and roll back some of the privatization which this particular government is obsessive about, and realize that there are some things that belong to the public. Thank God we have a Supreme Court which is bold and took a stand, for example, when they wanted to privatize the prisons, which seems to be just completely off the wall. The Supreme Court said, no, there are some functions the government cannot divest itself of. Even if it's going to save you money by outsourcing, you have to take responsibility. So I think that I would like to see a government with us in it that would really reclaim the commons and offer Israelis once again a sense that they have the country belongs to them, and they're responsible for it, but they also have the privilege of access to it. So those are some of the values which we bring to the table, which are fundamentally different. And they're manifested in our economic platform, which calls for a change in the tax structure. We don't understand why we have to tax good things when we should be taxing bad things like pollution. We should have, and the first signs of this in Israel have begun. For example, our cars are heavily taxed, but if you have an electric car, it's much less so. And if you have a gas guzzler, you pay 150% tax. So there are the start of these kind of steps, but we should like to see this in a lot of other areas as well. A real sense, I think Israel has, astonishingly, has a reasonable clean tech infrastructure in terms of our economic, but it's really a fraction of what it might be if the government would offer a little bit of incentives. It is to me crazy that almost every solar energy electricity plant in the world is based on Israeli technology or built by an Israeli company, yet not the first one has been built in Israel major. This is crazy. Israel has, until recently, no oil resources or no fossil fuel resources. We have sun, though. And I teach at Ben Gurion University, and I always think, what would our first prime minister, was such a visionary, do? He would say that Israel needs to be the first carbon-neutral country in the world. We have the sun to do it. Even using old solar technology, back of the envelope calculations show that with 10% of our Negev desert, which is lands which are already been damaged by highways in the military, we could be completely independent. If we use the new generation of concentrated photovoltaics, or some of these other solar thermal systems, we could use much less land. So I think this is the kind of vision we'd like to see our country doing in the same way that we did with drip irrigation, and the same way we did in the 1970s with passive solar water heating. So I expect more from Israel in this area, because I do believe that we have this incredible privilege to be responsible for a land that is holy, for four different major religions, and we need to do better. And this brings me actually to the fifth and maybe final value with which I will complete my comments, and maybe we'll start our discussion. And that is this notion of conquering. I mentioned Prime Minister Ben Gurion, who was a brilliant founding father, our George Washington, and he got it right on a lot of issues, but there's one issue which I think he didn't really have the tools to make an intelligent policy, and that was this notion of conquering the desert. He believed with all his soul and with his own actions that Israel would not survive if it did not conquer the Negev desert, which is about 60% of our lands. And in fact, in 1953, just after he was at the peak of his powers, he suddenly, almost overnight, resigned and moved to a teeny small kibbutz, a Marxist community in the Negev, to show the country that this was the future. But the thing is this, I think now we're a little more sophisticated ecologically and realize that you don't conquer a desert. If you want to live in a desert, you have to learn to live with the desert, because it's simply not sustainable. You're going to end up salinating your groundwater and then eroding your soils and doing all kinds of things that just don't make sense. And so I think we're learning now that there has to be a harmony and a partnership with the desert. And that same value, of course, should be true in terms of our relationship with the Palestinians. This is a complicated issue, and there's a whole lot of disinformation, which I find when I open up websites from leftist organizations, whatever. But there is one fundamental truth, and that is to say that ultimately Israel is not sustainable unless we make accommodation with our neighbors, and we need to do better. The Bible says, "Bakesh shalom u'hodfeu," request peace and not pursue it. Pursue it obsessively. Somebody's a hodef, somebody's mad about something. And I think that's the kind of government we'd like to be part of. We do believe that there has been tremendous progress in Israeli society in recognizing that a two-state solution, one for Israel, one for the Palestinians, is an inevitable and a desirable solution to the present conflict. Finding our way to the negotiating table, making that happen, is complicated. But what we argue is today 80% of Israelis believe that, and it's unimaginable that even a leader of a right-wing Likud party like Benjamin Netanyahu could walk into the U.S. Congress and say to them, if the Palestinians will recognize our right to live as a Jewish state, I will be the first one to raise my hand at the UN in favor of an independent Palestinian state. This is, I mean, if 20 years ago they would have thought he was on drugs.